Imagine for a second paying thousands of dollars for a highly specialized medical procedure.
Yeah, out of pocket usually.
Right, completely out of pocket. And you're told it's this minimally invasive, like 15-minute outpatient visit that's designed to instantly enhance your intimacy, boost your self-confidence, all of that.
It was a huge promise.
A massive promise. So you go through with it, you wait the recommended 4 hours to let the local anesthetic wear off, and then you give it a try. And then fast forward 12 weeks later, you're sitting back in the clinician's office, and you have to report this really frustrating reality.
That absolutely nothing happened.
Exactly. Zero results. No change in sensation. Just nothing.
And, that is a scenario that's playing out in aesthetic clinics all over the world right now, and the clinical response to that exact moment is incredibly complex.
So welcome to today's deep dive. For this session, we're looking at a stack of sources that sit right at this fascinating and honestly pretty contradictory intersection of biology, mechanics, and psychology.
Yeah, we have a really interesting mix today.
We do. We're examining official clinical guidelines from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, or ACOG. We also have a detailed cross-sectional study that analyzes Saudi women's attitudes toward cosmetic gynecology.
Plus a massive array of clinical protocols and FAQs from aesthetic medical practices globally.
And the contrast between those sources is just stark. I mean, you have rigorous medical skepticism on one side, and then this booming, massive consumer demand on the other.
Right. And our mission today is to figure out what happens when those two forces collide. We're exploring the rapidly growing world of cosmetic gynecology, specifically a procedure known as the G-shot.
Yeah, we're going to break down what it actually is, but our main focus today is on that exact scenario I mentioned at the start, what happens when it fails. We're going to look closely at the clinical approach to reevaluating what they call a non-responder.
Which is a patient who requests a second shot after that first trial is completely unsuccessful.
Right. And looking at that forces us to look past all the shiny marketing and just dive straight into the foundational anatomy and neuroscience of the human body.
It really does.
So whether you're a medical professional looking at these protocols, or someone interested in women's health, or you're just incredibly curious about how modern medicine attempts to engineer human anatomy, we are going to unpack a lot here.
There's definitely a lot to cover.
But, to understand why the procedure fails for a non-responder, we really need to know what a responder actually experiences first. So what is happening in the room during a G-shot?
Well, clinically, the procedure is referred to as G-spot amplification.
Okay.
And in practice, the physician is locating the Grafenberg spot. Anatomically, they're looking for a highly sensitive area that's typically located about 2 to 3 centimeters in from the urethral meatus, right along the anterior vaginal wall.
Got it.
So once they locate that targeted zone, they apply a local anesthetic. Then, the clinician uses a specially designed speculum to isolate the area, and they inject a filler directly into the submucosal space.
And looking at the clinical protocols, the actual injection takes literally a matter of seconds.
Oh yeah, usually just 5 to 8 seconds.
Wait, 5 to 8 seconds?
Yeah, it is incredibly fast. The material being injected is typically a high molecular weight hyaluronic acid, or sometimes they use a collagen filler.
Okay, let me stop you there, because that term, high molecular weight, really stood out in the sources. Why does the molecular weight of the acid even matter for a 5-second injection?
It matters because it changes the physical properties of the gel. Like hyaluronic acid is naturally occurring in the body, right?
Right.
But in aesthetic medicine, it's cross-linked to form a gel. So when you use a high molecular weight version, the gel is much thicker, it's more viscous, and a lot more structurally sound.
So it doesn't just dissolve immediately.
Exactly. It resists degrading quickly.
Why?
When it's injected, it creates this palpable amplification in the tissue. Basically, you can visualize a raised mound that's about the width of a quarter, and it projects about a 1/4 inch in height.
Okay, so it's essentially like using dermal fillers, the kind people use to plump their lips or smooth facial wrinkles.
Yes, very similar concept.
But it's applied internally to create a larger, target for mechanical stimulation. The high molecular weight ensures it actually holds that 1/4 inch shape under physical pressure.
That is the core mechanical premise, yeah. You're volumizing the tissue to make it more accessible to physical friction.
Right, functioning almost like internal architectural scaffolding.
That's a great way to put it. And because the body naturally metabolizes hyaluronic acid over time, that physical scaffolding slowly dissolves. So the effects generally only last for about 3 to 5 months.
Okay, here is where I am really struggling to reconcile our sources.
The controversy part.
Yes, the controversy. Because the aesthetic clinics cite this pilot study claiming that 87% of women reported enhanced sexual arousal and gratification after this simple, fast injection.
87% is a huge number.
It's massive. But then I read the official ACOG committee opinion. And let me actually read a direct quote from their guidelines so you, listening right now, can hear just how strong this language is.
Go ahead.
ACOG explicitly states that procedures like G-spot amplification are, quote, not medically indicated. They point to a complete lack of high-quality, peer-reviewed data regarding long-term safety and efficacy.
Right.
And they state these, quote, should not be offered as routine surgical procedures. They even go so far as to mandate that they should never be performed on patients under 18 unless it's to reconstruct significant congenital malformations.
They are definitely not mincing words.
No. And obviously for you listening, we have to emphasize we're not taking a side here. We're just presenting the landscape. But how are clinics reporting an 87% success rate while the governing medical body is basically slamming the brakes?
Well, you have to consider the difference between a small pilot study that's often funded or promoted by the aesthetic industry versus the kind of rigorous, double-blind, long-term data that a body like ACOG requires to endorse any surgical intervention.
Okay. That makes sense.
Right, because aesthetic clinics are relying heavily on subjective patient reporting. I mean, if a patient says they feel better, the clinic calls it a clinical success.
But ACOG wants hard data.
Exactly. ACOG is looking at the overall lack of anatomical consensus. Medical science still heavily debates the exact histological nature of the G-spot itself.
Really? Still?
Yeah. So ACOG's stance is essentially that you cannot standardize a surgical augmentation for an anatomical structure that varies so wildly from person to person.
Which honestly makes the explosion in global consumer demand even more fascinating.
Oh, absolutely.
Because ACOG is waving this huge red flag, yet clinics are booked solid. So to figure out what is driving a patient to bypass the medical establishment entirely, we really need to look at that Saudi study.
Yeah, that study is incredibly revealing.
Right. The researchers surveyed 325 Saudi women to basically gauge their attitudes toward cosmetic gynecology.
And the demographic data in that cross-sectional study is fascinating. The actual prevalence, meaning the number of women who had already undergone one of these procedures, was actually very low.
But the intent to undergo one in the future was super high, right?
Yes. And it was heavily skewed by a single variable, which was awareness.
Just knowing about it.
Exactly. Through logistic regression analysis, the researchers found that women who simply had knowledge that these procedures existed were 2.82 times more likely to want to undergo them.
That is wild. Just knowing the option exists almost triples the desire for it.
It really highlights the power of marketing.
So what reasons did the women give for wanting the surgery in the study?
Well, the motivations were highly varied, but the top two are definitely the most telling. Improving physical appearance was cited by 32.95% of the respondents. But the highest motivator, coming in at 35.80%, was increasing self-confidence.
Wow.
Yeah. Actual performance improvement only accounted for 19.32%, and fixing physical sexual discomfort was the lowest at just 11.93%.
I am really stuck on those top two statistics.
Yeah.
I mean, if almost 33% want to improve appearance and nearly 36% want self-confidence, how does a hidden internal hyaluronic acid filler achieve that?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, because we're talking about a quarter-inch mound of clear gel on the anterior vaginal wall. It literally doesn't change your outward appearance at all.
No, it doesn't. And you've identified the core psychological disconnect that kind of haunts this entire field of medicine.
How so?
For a lot of these patients, the physical injection is actually acting as a proxy for psychological validation. Because society, the media, they heavily market this idea of optimal intimacy and perfect anatomy. And when a patient feels they are falling short of that completely idealized standard, they start looking for a tangible medical solution.
To resolve an emotional deficit.
Exactly. They genuinely believe that fixing the hardware will automatically upgrade their self-esteem.
Which brings us right back to the core focus of today's deep dive.
The non-responder.
The non-responder. A patient who is desperately seeking that massive confidence boost goes in, gets the injection, and becomes a non-responder. She shows up at her 12-week follow-up and just says, it failed.
Yeah, and that's a tough conversation.
So looking at the clinical protocols, why does this highly viscous structural filler suddenly just do nothing?
Well, the protocols reveal that failure is rarely a single isolated issue. It's usually a multifaceted breakdown, and it starts with anatomical and neurological realities.
Right, going back to what ACOG pointed out.
Exactly. Human anatomy is not standardized. The neural density of the anterior vaginal wall varies immensely from person to person.
Meaning the actual nerve endings.
Right. Some individuals possess a very high concentration of sensitive nerve endings in that specific 2 to 3 centimeter zone, but others simply do not have dense innervation there at all.
Wait, so do the clinicians have a way to map out those nerves before they actually inject the filler? Like, can they see if the nerves are actually there?
No, they really can't.
Are you serious?
Yeah, there is no simple outpatient imaging tool that maps individual microscopic nerve endings in the mucosal tissue prior to an injection.
So they're just guessing.
The clinician is essentially making an educated anatomical guess based on average physiological landmarks. But if a patient lacks dense nerve endings in that specific location naturally, injecting hyaluronic acid won't magically generate new nerves.
You're just taking numb tissue and making it larger.
Precisely.
Wow. Okay, so the foundation has to be neurologically sound to begin with.
Yes.
What about the physical foundation? Because the sources mention hormonal failures actually causing the gel to flatten out.
Hormonal status is a massive point of failure here. Severe estrogen deficiency is very common, particularly during menopause or in the postpartum period.
Right.
And estrogen is directly responsible for maintaining the thickness, the elasticity, and the blood flow of the vaginal mucosal lining.
Okay, so without enough estrogen.
Without adequate systemic estrogen, that tissue thins out significantly and becomes incredibly fragile.
It makes me think of, like, trying to build a heavy brick wall on top of a mattress instead of a concrete foundation.
That is an excellent architectural analogy.
Because if the tissue underneath the filler is thin and unsupported, that heavy hyaluronic acid gel isn't going to hold its quarter-inch projection. It's just going to sink and shift and flatten out under the physical friction of intercourse.
Exactly. The structural integrity of the filler is entirely dependent on the structural integrity of the host tissue.
That makes total sense.
But moving beyond just the tissue, we also see muscular causes for failure, and these involve the pelvic floor.
The pelvic floor.
Yeah, it's a complex hammock of muscles that supports all the pelvic organs. Now, if a patient has hypertonicity, which means severe involuntary spasms or chronic tightness of the levator ani muscles, if they have that, any applied friction can cause acute pain that completely overrides any potential pleasure.
Oh, so the physical stimulation just hurts instead of helping.
Right. And the reverse is true as well. The protocols also mention hypotonia.
Which is muscle weakness.
Yes. If the pelvic floor muscles are weak, the vaginal walls cannot provide the necessary mechanical counterpressure against the filler. The G-shot requires resistance to create friction. So if the surrounding muscles are too loose, the filler basically just gets pushed out of the way without ever stimulating the localized nerves.
So if we put all of that together, a postpartum woman might be the prime demographic seeking this procedure to regain her self-confidence, especially based on that Saudi study. Yet biologically, she might have low estrogen causing thin tissue and hypotonia from childbirth causing weak muscles. She could literally be the absolute worst candidate for this specific physical intervention.
And that is the exact paradox clinicians face every day.
Wow.
And there's a final, arguably more complex reason for a non-responder, which is psychosexual misdiagnosis.
Meaning the issue wasn't physical at all.
Exactly. If a patient is silently suffering from female sexual arousal disorder, which involves a complex lack of physical response to stimulation, or primary anorgasmia.
Which means she's never achieved orgasm under any circumstances.
Right. If that's the case, a localized tissue filler will not cure the underlying condition. It just won't.
It's just incredible to think about what this means for you, the listener.
Yeah.
Like whether you're navigating your own health or you're just fascinated by the science of it all. Human sexuality is this incredibly delicate, interconnected web.
It really is.
You have the hormonal foundation, the muscular support system, the neural pathways, and the psychological state of mind. You cannot just alter one single physical variable, like tissue volume, and guarantee a result.
Which brings us right to the most critical part of the medical protocols we analyzed, the reevaluation strategy.
Right, because when that non-responder is sitting in the office, unhappy, and says, it didn't work, I want a second shot, what does the clinician actually do?
Well, if you're a responsible clinician, you don't just jam a second syringe of filler in there and hope for the best.
Yeah, I'd hope not. It's like a mechanic diagnosing a car that won't start. If you put in a new battery and it still doesn't start, you don't just jam a second battery in there. You have to check the alternator, the starter, the wiring, all of it.
Exactly. And the clinical action plan for reevaluating a non-responder is highly systematic, just like that. And it addresses every single failure point we just discussed.
So what's step one?
Step one is hormone optimization. Before a clinician even prepares another syringe, they absolutely must evaluate the patient's systemic estrogen and often their testosterone levels.
Okay, checking the blood work.
Right. If the blood panels show a deficit, that underlying hormonal imbalance must be treated first. Usually that's done through localized or systemic hormone replacement therapy.
Going back to the mattress analogy, you have to pour the concrete foundation first.
Yes. The tissue has to be rebuilt from the inside out so it can actually support the physical scaffold of the filler.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So what is step two in the troubleshooting protocol?
Step two is assessing the physical technique and the patient's anatomy from that first round.
Like, did they do it right the first time?
Essentially, yeah.
Wow.
The clinician has to ask, did the coital friction just flatten the gel? Because if so, they might need to use a filler with a higher viscosity this time.
Oh, I see.
But more importantly, they have to deeply consider the depth of the initial injection.
What happens if they mess up the depth? Like, if they miss the submucosal space?
Well, the sources specifically warn against injecting too deeply. If the clinician accidentally bypasses the mucosal layer and injects that high molecular weight filler deep into the periurethral smooth muscle, the filler is essentially lost.
Lost.
Yeah, it won't project into the vaginal canal to create the necessary friction at all.
Oh, so it just sits in the muscle.
It just sits there.
Yeah.
And worse, because it is sitting in the smooth muscle near the urethra, it can actually cause urinary discomfort or urgency instead of any kind of sexual enhancement.
Oh, wow, that sounds awful.
Yeah.
So the clinician has to evaluate if the previous placement was simply too deep.
Yes.
Okay, so they verify the hormones and they adjust the depth and the thickness of the filler. What happens if they look at all that and realize that physical volume alone just isn't going to solve the problem for this specific patient?
That leads to step three, which is combination approaches.
Combination approaches.
Right. If volumizing the tissue failed, advanced aesthetic practices will often start to stack different modalities. So for example, they might pair a secondary G-shot with a procedure called the O-shot.
Okay, we should definitely define the difference between those two for the listener because the terminology gets really confusing very quickly.
It does. So the G-shot, as we've established, uses hyaluronic acid. It is a purely structural, architectural intervention. It just adds volume.
Got it.
The O-shot, on the other hand, uses platelet-rich plasma, or PRP.
How does that work?
The clinician actually draws the patient's own blood. They spin it down in a centrifuge to isolate the platelets, and then they inject that plasma into the tissue.
Wait, why inject plasma? What does that actually do on a cellular level?
Platelets contain these really powerful growth factors. When it's injected, PRP is regenerative. It triggers this biological cascade that stimulates the growth of new blood vessels.
Oh, okay.
That process is called angiogenesis, and it can actually encourage the regeneration of nerve sensitivity and collagen production in the clitoris and the vaginal walls.
So if the G-shot is like building a new room in a house, the O-shot is upgrading the electrical wiring and the plumbing to that room.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
You're combining the structural scaffolding with actual regenerative nerve and blood flow stimulation.
Precisely. And, clinics don't just stop at PRP. The protocols also introduce non-ablative erbium-YAG vaginal lasers into this combination strategy.
Lasers. I always think of lasers in dermatology as tools used to remove things, like laser hair removal or tattoo removal. How does a laser help a non-responder?
Well, a non-ablative laser doesn't destroy or remove the surface tissue. Instead, it delivers controlled thermal energy deep into the mucosal layers.
Okay.
This heat creates microscopic thermal injuries, and the body's natural healing response to these microinjuries is to produce massive amounts of new collagen and elastin fibers.
So it's tricking the body into healing itself.
Exactly. Over several sessions, the laser effectively thickens and tightens the mucosal lining. It restores the elasticity and the robust health of the tissue, which ultimately creates a much stronger foundation for that hyaluronic acid filler to sit on.
Okay, so we have hormones, specialized fillers, blood plasma injections and thermal lasers.
Yeah.
What about the muscular component we discussed earlier, like the hypertonicity or hypotonia?
Right, that requires bringing in outside specialists. A responsible clinician will prescribe targeted pelvic floor physical therapy at this stage.
To fix the muscle tone.
Yes. A specialized physical therapist works with the patient over weeks or even months to correct the tone. If there are spasms, they use manual release techniques to relax the levator ani muscles so that penetration isn't painful.
And if they have the weakness?
If there is weakness, they use biofeedback and resistance training to strengthen the pelvic floor so the vaginal walls can actually press back against the filler.
This sounds entirely different from the marketing promise. I mean, we started this deep dive with a quick 15-minute lunchtime fix, and now we are talking about a months-long multidisciplinary rehabilitation program that involves endocrinology, regenerative medicine, laser physics, and physical therapy.
It's a massive escalation. And that reality is the foundation of step 4, which is managing expectations and ultimately knowing when to stop.
Because it doesn't always work, even with all of that.
Right. Sometimes a second or third treatment works because all of these combination therapies have this cumulative regenerative effect on the tissue over time. But the clinical protocols are very clear about the limits of aesthetic medicine.
So what is the hard line? Like, where does a clinician have to just say no to a third try?
If through this exhaustive troubleshooting process, the clinician identifies deep psychosexual issues, severe relationship discord, or clinical anorgasmia that just isn't shifting despite optimal physical conditions, they must pivot.
They have to stop the physical treatments.
Yes. The protocol mandates moving away from syringes and energy devices entirely. The patient must be referred out for specialized sex therapy or to a urogynecologist for a complex surgical evaluation.
Wow.
The clinician has to accept and, help the patient accept that an anatomical intervention cannot fix a psychological or systemic condition.
It is such a profound shift from treating a localized spot to treating the whole patient.
It really is.
Well, let's recap what we've unpacked today. We started with the basic mechanics. This incredibly fast 8-second injection of high molecular weight hyaluronic acid, designed to act as internal scaffolding for 3 to 5 months.
Right.
We saw how this procedure is met with strict warnings and a total lack of medical endorsement from ACOG. Yet consumer demand just continues to skyrocket, driven heavily by awareness and this deep psychological desire for self-confidence like we saw in the Saudi study.
And we saw that when that initial injection fails, the reevaluation of a non-responder requires a vast multidisciplinary diagnostic process.
Clinicians have to troubleshoot systemic hormone levels, precise anatomical placement, regenerative combination therapies like PRP and lasers, and targeted muscular physical therapy.
It's a lot.
It perfectly illustrates that human intimacy isn't a simple mechanism you can just, plump up and fix. You need the perfect alignment of hormones, healthy tissue, muscle tone, nerve density, and emotional presence.
Which leaves us with a critical question to consider, really based on the stark divide in our sources today.
What's that?
If our understanding of human anatomy and sexual response is so highly individualized, if a physical augmentation can yield an 87% success rate in a small pilot study, yet require a vastly complex web of hormonal, psychological, and muscular troubleshooting just to achieve a baseline change for a non-responder.
Right.
Are we expecting too much from aesthetic medicine? Are we trying to solve the deeply complex, holistic human experience of intimacy and confidence with a simple mechanical quick fix?
That is definitely something for you to mull over.